thank you for that wonderful presentation. You started by saying that good films have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have an ending, but in no particular order. The United Nations' quest for peace has a beginning. Maybe it has a middle, and perhaps it has no end, because it is a work in progress. The work of the United Nations with regard to peace is one about conflict, of how to abate conflict, how to bring it to an end. And since conflict doesn't happen overnight, peace cannot happen overnight. There are many levels at which conflict happens. There are remote causes, there are intermediate causes, and there are immediate causes. In the same way, the work of peace is immediate and it is long-term. So let me share with you today 9 snap thoughts, not snapshots, but 9 snap thoughts, which hopefully will make you think about the work of the United Nations and perhaps understand the work of peace from a slightly different perspective. There are no clear answers here. It's a journey that has only begun over the last 70 years. So first and foremost, history. How did it all begin? The quest for peace has existed since time immemorial. Prophets, whether it is Jesus, Buddha, Mahavira, or even Confucius, have sought peace at the personal level. But institutional peace began first with the Hellenic and the Peloponnesian leagues, who were trying to balance each other in the ancient Greek city-state. We fast forward to the Middle Ages and after that, and you have the emergence of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, in which the modern state is born, which becomes the building brick of the contemporary state system, and its abiding principle is sovereignty, that nobody can interfere within the state and the state pursues national interests. If we move forward to the 18th century, you have philosophers in Europe thinking about perpetual peace, sustainable peace, such as Immanuel Kant. And then you have, in the late 18th century, the Napoleonic Wars, massive conflict, and in 1815, you have the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna develops some rules between states in Europe on how to engage with each other, how to consult with each other. And as a consequence, and because of some other reasons, you have a situation of a golden peace for 100 years until the outbreak of the World War, or the First World War, in 1914. But during this period, the first generation of international institutions, international organizations, are laid. You have, for example, the International Postal Union or the International Telecommunication Union formed. These are institutions which we take for granted today. But when you post your letter today and nobody reads it and it reaches on time, that is an outcome of international cooperation, not conflict. When today there are laws about how soldiers should be treated when they are captured, it comes out of the Hague Conferences of 1899 and 1907. And these are the first generation efforts at international cooperation. Immediately after the First World War, you have the League of Nations emerges as a second generation of international organizations. It does not last very long because you have the Great Economic Depression. And as a consequence of that, you have the Second World War, and of course, because also of the rise of fascism. And 6 years of warfare was one of the most terrible, probably the most terrible war in which mankind has been engaged, which ends with the explosion of the nuclear bomb and which impels states to come together and create the third generation of international institution, the United Nations system. But just imagine that 70 years ago, there was a collective effort by states to deal with collective problems of peace and security. It's a very ambitious goal because you're trying to undo almost 7,000 years of habits of thinking, of habits of the heart, a change in mindset. And it is not going to take 700 years, it may take another 1,000 years, but that journey has begun. It is a very unique and ambitious project. Now, in any particular exercise, when you look at it, you have to understand it first, which brings me to the second point, that you have to calibrate your expectations. And it is only when you calibrate your expectations and you understand the subject under examination that you really appreciate both the possibilities and the constraints upon it. Now, of course, I discovered the United Nations as a young boy in 8th grade when my English teacher came in and one day wrote on the board, "Wherever dark clouds loom, the United Nations is empowered to resolve the crisis. Discuss." She asked us to go to the US Public Library, the British Council, and research it and write about it. And this is where I discovered the Security Council. This is where I discovered the General Assembly. This is where I discovered the 5-power veto in the Security Council, the work of peace, of how in the 50s and 60s, soldiers were dropped beyond the line of hostilities to negotiate between two sides, whether it was in the Suez, whether it was in Korea, whether it was in the Congo. All exercises which are still with us, but that was the beginning. Of course, that period also has seen the shepherding of Namibia into independence through the United Nations, the referendum in Eritrea to bring Eritrean independence. Small but significant successes in building the bricks of peace. So I'm no longer as naive as that child who wrote that essay that you can bring world peace immediately. But after 20 years of work in the United Nations, I appreciate to some extent the possibilities and the limitations, and that the cup is half full. It is not half empty, and it needs the collective efforts of humankind to take it to the next level. Now, one also has to appreciate the environment within which you function. This brings me to the third point, that the United Nations is a product of states. It is not an independent personality. States shape its mandates, states provide the funds. And therefore, the United Nations has to work within those parameters. And it is this particular context which has to be understood, because states are sovereign. They were created under the principle of the Treaty of Westphalia, which was enunciated in 1648. And that particular principle continues to dominate world politics. Every state wants to call the shots. And there are 194 states in the United Nations. The budget of the United Nations, peacekeeping budget particularly, and its regular budget, is only $10 billion, which is the budget of the New York Police Department to run the 5 boroughs of New York City. And you have 20 such operations, peacekeeping operations all over the world. And if you added up all the clientele of the UN across the world, it would amount to about 100 million plus. And if you put that together in one particular space, it would be the 11th largest country. So the resources have to be expanded, and the political will has to be hardened. So that is the environment within which the UN functions. We have to recognize that it is a product of states, and it cannot be more than the states. Which brings me to the fourth point, which is that the peace architecture of the United Nations is not frozen. It is neither an art, nor is it a science. Perhaps it's a bit of alchemy, perhaps it's a craft, but it is constantly evolving based on the experience in the field. If you look at the Charter of the United Nations, that charter in Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 provides 3 particular approaches to peace, a soft and a hard approach. Chapter 6 is about negotiation, conciliation, and arbitration. Chapter 7 is about enforcement, the kind of enforcement you had in Korea. And in between, you have the innovation of peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, and prevention. So a little bit of Ayurveda, a little bit of allopathy, and a little bit of nutritive science going into it, if I can use those medical analogies. Now this, of course, was systematized by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the former Secretary General, in the early 90s. What he did was that he reviewed the work of the UN for the last 45 years then, and came to the conclusion that there were essentially three aspects to peace. One, that the agenda of peace had to be founded on a broader definition of peace, which included not only political aspects, but social and economic aspects. Second, that the social and economic aspects were related to inclusive development. And third, that you couldn't have sustainable peace unless it was peace that came organically from within through democracy. Therefore, an agenda for peace, an agenda for development, and an agenda for democracy. Now, this itself is a dialectical process. He identified these elements, and there have been experiments in the field in various missions through the 90s and the early period of 2000, in which there has been a great amount of learning. And that learning led in 2006 for the heads of states to review what had happened and to chart the course for the 21st century. Now, this is a very interesting moment, because you are looking at what has the UN done in the last 10, 15 years, which is meaningful, because there were the massacres of Rwanda, there were the massacres of Srebrenica, and the UN was unable to do this because the mandates given to it were far greater than the resources provided to it. But you have, because of this, the emergence of the International Criminal Court, which today has indicted, and the war crime tribunals, at least 2 presidents. Now, this was unthinkable 30 years ago, that a head of state could be indicted for not necessarily pulling the trigger, but providing the command to kill people in his own country. Second, you find today, for example, the United Nations in Syria dismantling chemical weapons through the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Third, you find today the United Nations through the International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring the agreement for limiting the nuclear direction of Iran, which was signed recently last year. You find United Nations through the World Health Organization dealing with AIDS and Ebola. You find the United Nations in the Eastern Congo having introduced a new resolution for the first time in the history of humankind, where sexual exploitation and abuse are actually contained by a UN force intervention brigade against militias. Now, these things don't hit the headlines every day. Bad news does, but good news does not. And we need to go beyond the bad news to understand what is quietly happening in this world and how it is changing the world. Now, there's a very new doctrine which came out of the summit of the heads of state. It was called the responsibility to protect. And it's a very interesting doctrine, a very controversial doctrine. It basically says that if states don't perform duties to their citizens, then the world through the United Nations can enter that country under UN resolutions to set a certain human rights situation right if it gets too egregious. It can push a particular country to feed its people. It can deal with a particular situation of violence. Of course, many developing countries and emerging countries have taken that to mean that the United Nations might become an avenue for first world domination and a new kind of imperialism. So the humanitarian intervention is a highly controversial aspect, but nonetheless, the notion of sovereignty is coming into question, that you cannot let countries kill their own citizens, and if they do not exercise their right to protect their citizens, perhaps under certain conditions, the United Nations might, through the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, engage in that country. Now, this was first exercised only a few years ago in Libya, when the United Nations Resolution 1370 was used to protect the people in Benghazi when Gaddafi threatened to launch attacks against him, his own people. So the world is changing. It is not static. The United Nations is changing. It is not static. Slowly by slowly, it is learning. Now, of course, to keep the peace, you must have a peace. Very often, you get engaged because the world wants you to go and do something. And you don't really have a peace agreement. So if you don't have a peace agreement, you cannot keep a peace agreement. But it does give a chance when you separate the forces for the world to start talking about it. And this happened in Bosnia, where for at least 2 to 3 years while the killing was going on, the UN went there and tried to separate the forces, however limited it might be, to deliver humanitarian assistance till the talking could lead to a peace agreement, the Dayton Agreement, on the basis of which you've had the new countries like Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia emerge and get formalized in the international system. But this is something you have to think about, that very often peacekeeping is only a step to peacemaking. Now, there are other situations where peacemaking may take place first, as in Cambodia. It took place in 1992, in Mozambique in the same year, where you have a peace which is made and you go and implement it and make the transition to normalization and stabilization. But this cannot be done alone. It needs global citizenship. It needs a wide array of actors. Currently, most of the non-governmental actors are mostly from the West. So new non-governmental organizations, new elements of international civil society have to engage. Now, for example, in health policy, the Gates Foundation has got quite involved with the World Health Organization in both providing resources, but also providing very interesting and thoughtful inputs to getting health policy ahead. So that's one way to do it. The second way to do it is to engage deeply with your own governments and to engage with yourself of how do you become a global citizen. How do you build a culture of values rather than a value culture as an end in itself? And for this, I have to say that peace is more than just a word. That peace is about food. It is about deprivation, of the removal of deprivation. It is about bringing women to the center of the United Nations. It is about bringing women to the center of decision-making within countries in the world. And as Dag Hammarskjöld once put it, that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven. It was created to prevent mankind from descending into hell. Thank you very much.